Imagine a world where some of the most powerful and advanced civilizations suddenly vanished, as if erased from the face of the earth in the blink of an eye. The silence after their destruction is almost deafening. Entire cities, once vibrant and bustling with life, now lay in ruin, forgotten to time. The era of the Bronze Age, a period of prosperity and human ingenuity, came to an abrupt end. The question that lingers is, what caused this sudden downfall, and how did it impact the course of history? Around the 13th century BC, the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond witnessed an unprecedented collapse. The once mighty palaces of the Minoan civilization in Greece crumbled to dust, leaving behind nothing but memories of a glorious past. The great city of Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, was set aflame, abandoned, and lost to the annals of history. The signs of this monumental collapse were clear. The roads that once led to flourishing trade networks were now abandoned, and the technological advancements that defined this age slowly began to fade. For centuries, the civilizations of the Bronze Age thrived, with intricate trade routes linking distant corners of the world, rich with metals, spices, and cultural exchanges. But all of that was shattered in a wave of destruction that no one could foresee. And in the aftermath of this upheaval, the world would be forced to find new ways to survive, adapt, and rebuild. One of the most intriguing aspects of this collapse is the mysterious appearance of the Sea Peoples. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what was their role in this great upheaval? Egyptian records are the only source we have of their existence, yet their origins remain one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. These marauding warriors seem to appear out of nowhere, sweeping through the Eastern Mediterranean, attacking cities from Troy to the Levant, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Their raids were so devastating that they changed the course of history, impacting civilizations that had thrived for centuries. But the fall of these civilizations wasn't just a matter of military defeat. It was the collapse of an entire system, a network of commerce, culture, and technology that had brought prosperity to the ancient world. The trade routes that once carried precious metals like tin and copper, essential for the creation of bronze, were severed. With the supply chains disrupted, bronze, the metal that had fueled the Bronze Age, became increasingly scarce. This scarcity set off a chain reaction, forcing societies to look for alternatives. And they found it iron. Unlike copper and tin, which were hard to come by, iron was plentiful. From the bog iron of Scandinavia to the rich iron ore deposits of Central Europe, this new resource was readily available. But iron was not just another metal, it was a game changer. It was stronger, more durable, and far more versatile than bronze. Iron had the potential to reshape the very foundations of society. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of trial, error, and an ancient form of experimentation that would eventually lead to one of the most important technological revolutions in history. In the ruins of the fallen civilizations, a new world was born. Iron began to replace bronze, not just in weapons and tools, but also in the way people thought about their place in the world. This new metal brought with it new possibilities, new technologies, and a new way of life. The fall of the Bronze Age civilizations marked the end of one era, but the beginning of another. It was a period of immense upheaval, where the old was swept away and the new began to emerge from the ashes. This was not just the destruction of cities, but the destruction of the very systems that had upheld the societies for centuries. What followed was a world in which the old ways were no longer enough. People had to adapt or perish, and those who embraced iron as their new tool of survival were the ones who would shape the future of the ancient world. This was a time of innovation born from necessity. Societies, once dependent on the fragile systems of trade and diplomacy, began to shift their focus towards self-sufficiency. With the abundance of iron came the birth of new technologies that would eventually lead to the establishment of new empires, new kingdoms, and a new way of life. But why is this period so important to us today? What lessons can we learn from the rise and fall of these ancient civilizations? The answers lie in the very nature of human ingenuity, our ability to adapt, survive, and thrive in the face of catastrophic change. Just as the collapse of the Bronze Age societies pushed humanity toward the discovery of iron, so too Do the challenges we face today have the potential to spark new innovations and ways of thinking? So, as you listen to the story of this ancient collapse, think about the parallels in your own life. What challenges are you facing that could push you to discover something new, something revolutionary? How can we, just like our ancestors, learn from the past and use it to build a better future? But before we dive deeper into this fascinating journey of discovery and transformation, I want to take a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content and want to see more videos like this, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us create more engaging and informative content, and it gives us the motivation to continue bringing you these deep dives into history. Don't miss out, subscribe now, and stay tuned for the rest of the story. We've only just scratched the surface of the mysteries waiting to be uncovered. As we stand at the precipice of the past, it's important to remember that every great civilization, no matter how mighty, how prosperous, eventually falls. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations wasn't just the end of an era, it was a revolution in the making, a transition that would shape the very foundations of our world today. Imagine the moment when those once thriving cities, their walls echoing with the hum of daily life, became silent. Imagine the marketplaces, the temples, the thriving cultures all swept away. No warning, no foretelling, only a sudden, overwhelming collapse. Entire peoples who had once built empires now faced the ashes of their legacy, forced to rebuild from scratch. They had no choice but to adapt, to evolve, or to vanish into obscurity. The fall of the civilizations we often regard as the pinnacle of human achievement is a harsh reminder of the fragility of success. One might think that their wealth, their advanced technologies, and their vast networks would have been enough to withstand the storms of time. Yet, the very systems they relied upon, the trade routes, the shared resources, the diplomatic alliances, crumbled, leaving nothing but questions. The destruction was not just physical, it was psychological, cultural, and deeply spiritual for those who survived. For those who lived through it, it must have seemed as if the entire world had been upended. The order they had once known was gone. The past was no longer a blueprint for the future, and in the aftermath of this upheaval, one of the most remarkable transformations began to take shape. This moment of destruction gave birth to something entirely new, the rise of iron. While bronze had been the symbol of power and wealth, iron became the foundation of the new world. Iron, a metal that was abundant and relatively easy to forge, stood in stark contrast to the expensive, scarce copper and tin that had once been traded across the seas. Now, iron was everywhere. The people who understood how to wield it became the new masters of their fate. And they weren't just making weapons. They were forging tools that would transform agriculture, enable new forms of construction, and create a new economy based on material abundance rather than scarcity. Iron could be shaped into plows to cultivate the land, into axes to clear forests, into tools to build shelters, a far cry from the delicate bronze weapons and ornaments of the past. As iron became the cornerstone of this new era, the old systems of trade and commerce were replaced by self-sufficiency. Communities that had once relied on the distant, unstable trade routes for their survival now turned inward, finding strength in their ability to produce what they needed locally. The global network that had connected civilizations across the Mediterranean was no longer as vital. Instead, localized economies began to take shape. But this wasn't just about survival, it was about empowerment. With iron came the possibility of greater strength and resilience, not just in weapons, but in the very fabric of society. The new tools weren't just functional, they symbolized a revolution in human capability. They marked the shift from a world of delicate balance to one of rugged endurance. The old world had collapsed, but the new world was stronger, harder, and more resourceful. Iron allowed these societies to thrive again, to build, to expand. It laid the foundation for future empires, for new technological innovations, for agricultural revolutions, and for military strategies that would define the next centuries of human history. But as we reflect on this transformation, it's important to ask ourselves, what lessons can we draw from this period of profound change? The fall of the Bronze Age civilizations wasn't just a collapse, it was a metamorphosis, a transformation that arose from destruction. It was a moment when the old world died and the new one was born from its ashes. And this same pattern has repeated itself throughout history, not just in the distant past, but in the modern world as well. Think of the technological revolutions we are experiencing today. The rise of the internet, the digital age, and artificial intelligence, these are our iron. Just as iron gave the ancient civilizations the tools they needed to rebuild and thrive, our modern technologies are reshaping our societies in ways we can't yet fully comprehend. And just like the civilizations of the Bronze Age, we too are facing a moment of great upheaval. The world we once knew is changing, and it is up to us to adapt to these changes. What are we creating with our iron today? Are we forging a future that will be as transformative as the rise of iron in ancient times? Are we using our tools, our technologies, to build a society that is stronger, more resilient, and more connected than the one before? Or are we allowing ourselves to be swept away by the very forces of change that we created? The challenges we face today, while unique, are not unlike those faced by the ancient peoples whose civilizations crumbled. But the real question is, will we emerge from this upheaval stronger, more resourceful, and more innovative? Just as the fall of the Bronze Age civilizations gave rise to the Iron Age, so too can our current challenges spark the next great era of human achievement. The key lies in how we respond to the crisis. Do we crumble, or do we adapt? The collapse of the Bronze Age teaches us that everything is temporary. Empires rise and fall, technologies come and go. But one thing remains constant: our ability to adapt. The world will continue to change, and the systems we rely on today may not be the ones we need tomorrow. We must learn from the past, take the lessons of resilience and reinvention, and apply them to our own time. The ancient world was forced to find new solutions in the face of collapse, and today, we too must rise to meet the challenges of our time, embracing new technologies, new ways of thinking, and new approaches to solving the problems that lie ahead. As we continue on this journey through history, let us keep this thought in mind. The collapse of the old does not always mean the end. It can be the beginning of something new, something more powerful, something that can reshape the world once again. But before we continue exploring this fascinating journey of transformation, I want to remind you to support our channel. If you found this story captivating and want to hear more deep dives into history, innovation, and the lessons of the past, please hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring you more content like this, and it gives us the motivation to keep creating videos that explore the mysteries of history and their relevance to our lives today. So, if you're ready to uncover more, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next chapter. We've only just begun to explore the untold stories that could change the way we look at our own future. The story of the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations is not just one of warfare, environmental disasters, or the gradual breakdown of systems. It is also the story of a mysterious force that swept through the ancient world, leaving only devastation in its wake. This force, shrouded in mystery and wrapped in layers of uncertainty, is known as the Sea Peoples. But who were they? Where did they come from? And why did they play such a central role in the downfall of entire civilizations? Their story begins with an unsettling silence in the historical records. The Egyptian sources are the primary ones that speak of these marauders, but they reveal little about their origins or true identity. These records are fragmented, sparse, and somewhat vague, offering only fleeting glimpses into the activities of a group of invaders whose identity has puzzled historians for centuries. Were they a confederation of different tribes? A nomadic force with no permanent homeland? Or were they something entirely different, a group united only by their devastating impact on the Mediterranean world? What we do know is that the Sea Peoples arrived as if from nowhere, sweeping across the ancient Mediterranean and causing destruction on an unimaginable scale. From Troy to the Levant, their raids were relentless, leaving once thriving cities reduced to rubble. These were not isolated attacks. They were a series of coordinated invasions that affected the eastern Mediterranean like a storm, toppling empires and shaking the foundations of the ancient world. The cities that had been the cradles of culture, art, trade, and power were now abandoned. Their once vibrant streets emptied, their grand temples reduced to piles of stones. In Egypt, the pharaohs were forced to reckon with these mysterious invaders. The Egyptian records, particularly from the reign of Ramses III, provide some of the most vivid descriptions of the Sea Peoples. They were depicted as fierce warriors, carrying swords and shields, their ships cutting through the waves with ease. They were a maritime force, and their very name evokes the image of seafaring marauders who descended upon the Mediterranean with relentless aggression. Yet, despite the accounts of their appearances, their exact origins remain one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in ancient history. Some scholars believe the Sea Peoples may have come from the Aegean, possibly from regions such as Anatolia or the islands of the eastern Mediterranean. Others speculate they could have been displaced peoples from the collapsing civilizations of the Bronze Age, pushed out by internal conflict, famine, or other environmental pressures. Still, others suggest they could have originated from as far away as the central Mediterranean or even the far reaches of the Italian peninsula. The truth remains elusive, leaving only the mark of their destruction in the historical record. What we do know is that their arrival was catastrophic. The Sea Peoples are often credited with contributing to the collapse of several powerful ancient civilizations, including the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and others throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The cities they attacked were not just military strongholds, they were cultural hubs. They were the centers of trade, art, science, and religion, places where entire societies thrived. But when the Sea Peoples arrived, they didn't just attack cities, they attacked the very lifeblood of these civilizations. They disrupted trade routes that had existed for centuries, cutting off vital resources that civilizations relied upon. They caused economic systems to crumble, leading to widespread famine and social instability. They didn't merely conquer, they broke the essence of what made these civilizations prosperous. It's important to understand that the impact of the Sea Peoples' attacks wasn't just military. It wasn't just about soldiers and weapons. It was about the collapse of entire systems, systems that had sustained human societies for centuries. When these invaders ravaged the cities, they left behind more than just rubble. They left behind a cultural void. The structures of trade that had once linked the ancient world, from the Levant to Egypt to Greece, were no longer operational. The flow of resources stopped, and with it, the flow of ideas, knowledge, and innovation. For a time, it seemed as if the ancient world had been thrown into a dark age. The disruption was so profound that some historians argue it played a pivotal role in the downfall of Bronze Age civilization as a whole. With the collapse of these interconnected trade systems, the world moved away from the prosperity of the Bronze Age and towards a more isolated, fragmented existence. But in the ashes of this destruction, something new would eventually arise, a shift from bronze to iron, a new metal that would shape the future of humanity. While the Sea Peoples left an indelible mark on the ancient world, they also forced those who survived to adapt in ways they never could have imagined. The people who lived through this catastrophe found themselves at a crossroads. On one hand, they had to rebuild from the ruins of what had once been a prosperous world. On the other, they had the opportunity to create something entirely new, a new age that would be defined by new technologies and new ways of thinking. The destruction caused by the Sea Peoples set the stage for the technological and cultural transformations that followed. Without their raids, it's possible that the widespread adoption of iron, a metal that would define the next phase of human development, might have been delayed. But as the old world collapsed, iron emerged as a new hope. Iron was more abundant and easier to obtain than bronze, and it provided the tools and weapons necessary for survival in a world that had become increasingly unstable. But what lessons can we learn from the Sea Peoples' role in the downfall of these civilizations? It's easy to see them as the villains of history, as destructive forces that caused untold damage. Yet, in a deeper sense, they were also a catalyst for change. Their arrival forced the ancient world to confront its vulnerabilities, to reassess the systems it had built, and to adapt to a new reality. It was this very upheaval, this moment of destruction, that sparked the rise of iron, a technology that would change the course of history. As we look back at the Sea Peoples, we are reminded of the power of transformation, both in the ancient world and in our own lives. When faced with overwhelming challenges, it is easy to feel like the world is collapsing around us. Yet, Just as the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations gave birth to the Iron Age, so too do our own challenges hold the potential for transformation. What seems like destruction in the moment may, in the long run, be the catalyst for a new beginning. Today, we live in a world of rapid change, where technological revolutions are reshaping our societies. The rise of artificial intelligence, the internet, and other groundbreaking technologies may seem overwhelming at times, but like the ancient civilizations, we must remember that change is inevitable. What matters is how we respond to it. Just as the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations gave rise to new possibilities, we too have the opportunity to shape the future in profound ways. In the end, the mystery of the Sea Peoples may never be fully solved, but their legacy lives on, not just in the ruins they left behind, but in the way they forced the ancient world to adapt and evolve. Their arrival was a reminder that no civilization, no matter how powerful, is immune to change. And in the face of change, the ability to adapt is the key to survival. As we continue to navigate our own period of change, let us take a lesson from the ancient world. Destruction can be the precursor to creation, and in every challenge lies the potential for growth. The Sea Peoples may have brought chaos, but they also brought a new era, one defined by iron, resilience, and transformation. What new era are we creating today? The Sea Peoples' legacy, shrouded in mystery and fear, is one that continues to echo through history. Their sudden arrival in the Mediterranean, their destruction of powerful civilizations, and the ultimate collapse of the Bronze Age world left an indelible mark that would shape the course of human civilization. But perhaps their greatest contribution to history was not simply the devastation they wrought, it was the transformation they triggered. The collapse they instigated brought with it a crisis, but also an opportunity to rise from the ashes, to adapt, and to embrace a new era. In the wake of their destruction, societies were faced with the harsh reality that the systems they had relied upon for centuries were no longer sustainable. Trade routes were destroyed, cities were abandoned, and the once great empires of the ancient world crumbled. The familiar ways of life, the intricate networks of commerce, and the systems of governance that had sustained these civilizations could not survive in the face of such relentless disruption. Yet, as the world of the Bronze Age collapsed, a new world was being born. Iron, a metal that had been known to ancient cultures but rarely used on a large scale, now became the cornerstone of the new age. The advent of iron technology was not just a technical breakthrough, it was a cultural shift. Iron was more abundant and easier to obtain than the copper and tin that were the foundations of bronze. The very material that had once been rare and precious became more accessible, and with it, the possibility of a new era of technological progress. This shift from bronze to iron was not a simple matter of replacing one metal with another. It was a paradigm shift that affected every aspect of society. The Iron Age brought with it new tools, new weapons, and new ways of thinking. The production of iron was less reliant on distant trade routes, allowing societies to become more self-sufficient. It empowered communities to rebuild in ways that were not possible with bronze. While bronze had been an expensive and limited resource, iron was something that could be produced in abundance, and it gave rise to new forms of innovation. The transition to the Iron Age also marked the beginning of the end of the ancient world as it had been known. The old empires that had once controlled vast territories were replaced by new kingdoms and city-states, each with its own unique approach to governance, culture, and warfare. The Sea Peoples, in their destruction, had inadvertently sparked the development of a new form of society. The world was no longer bound by the old trade routes and the old ways of doing things. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations had fractured the ancient world, but it also paved the way for the development of new, more resilient forms of life. The Sea People's role in this transformation cannot be understated. They were the catalyst for change, whether intentionally or not. The societies that survived the chaos left in their wake were forced to rethink their ways of life. They could no longer rely on the old systems of trade, politics, or technology. They had to adapt or perish. And in that moment of adaptation, the foundations of the modern world began to take shape. The destruction caused by the Sea Peoples was a powerful reminder of the fragility of civilizations. No matter how mighty, no matter how advanced, no society is immune to the forces of change. But it is in these moments of crisis that the true potential of human resilience is revealed. The Sea Peoples may have brought chaos, but they also brought a new beginning, a new era defined by the resilience of the human spirit, the strength of iron, and the adaptability of societies in the face of overwhelming change. Today, we find ourselves in a world that is changing just as rapidly as the ancient world did. Technological advancements are reshaping every aspect of our lives, from the way we communicate to the way we work and live. Just as the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations led to the rise of iron, so too can our own technological upheavals lead to the creation of a new world. But like the ancient civilizations, we must ask ourselves, how will we respond to the challenges before us? Will we rise from the ashes of our own crises, just as our ancestors did, to build something stronger, more resilient, and more sustainable? The Sea Peoples may have destroyed civilizations, but they also created the conditions for a new era. In the same way, the challenges we face today, whether they are environmental, technological, or political, have the potential to create new opportunities for growth and transformation. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations is a lesson in both destruction and creation. It teaches us that in the face of catastrophic change, there is always the potential for a new beginning. The Sea Peoples may have brought the ancient world to its knees, but it was in the ashes of their destruction that the Iron Age was born, an age that would shape the future of humanity for centuries to come. As we face our own modern challenges, let us remember the lessons of the past. Let us take inspiration from the resilience of those who survived the collapse of the Bronze Age and the transformation that followed. In every challenge lies the potential for growth, and in every moment of destruction lies the seed of creation. Just as the ancient world rose from the ashes of its collapse, so too can we rise from our own challenges to build a future that is stronger, more resilient, and more innovative than ever before. So, as we continue to navigate through the complexities of the modern world, let us ask ourselves, what will we create from the challenges before us? What new era are we shaping today, just as our ancient ancestors shaped the Iron Age in the aftermath of their own destruction? The Sea Peoples, in their fury and devastation, unknowingly sparked a revolution. And perhaps, in the chaos of our time, we too can find the spark that will ignite the next great transformation. The ancient world thrived on trade. For centuries, societies across the Mediterranean and beyond had relied on intricate networks of exchange. Trade was not just about goods, it was about survival. It was about culture, technology, knowledge, and connections that bound distant lands together. The products traded from metals and spices to art and ideas were the lifeblood of ancient civilizations. Cities flourished as they became hubs of commerce, cultural melting pots where ideas from every corner of the known world met. But as quickly as it had been built, this vast web of trade collapsed. The fall of the Bronze Age civilizations was, in many ways, the collapse of this interconnected world. The Sea Peoples, whose arrival wreaked havoc upon the Eastern Mediterranean, were only part of the story. The disruption they caused was not limited to the military or political upheaval. It was the very disruption of trade routes that lay at the heart of the collapse. Once these vital roads of exchange were severed, the societies that had depended on them were left vulnerable, exposed, and unable to sustain the prosperity they once enjoyed. The world they had known, one that connected Egypt to Greece, Troy to the Levant, Anatolia to the Nile, was suddenly, shockingly, no more. What had once been a seamless flow of resources, goods, and ideas was replaced by an unrelenting silence. With the collapse of these trade routes, the cities that once hummed with activity fell eerily quiet. What had seemed like a stable, thriving system, one that spanned continents and brought civilization to its peak, was torn apart in a matter of decades. The immense wealth that had flowed from one great city to the next, from the markets of Mycenae to the streets of Hattusa, vanished. The once coveted materials that fueled these civilizations, particularly bronze, became almost impossible to procure. Bronze, made from the alloy of copper and tin, was the material that had propelled the world into an age of unimaginable progress. But now, tin, which was already scarce to begin with, became even rarer as the supply lines that once brought it from distant lands were shattered. In a world where tin was already in short supply, the collapse of the trade routes meant that it was no longer possible to maintain the flow of this essential resource. The consequences were dire. Without tin, the production of bronze ground to a halt, and without bronze, there was no way to create the tools, weapons, or materials that had fueled the prosperity of the Bronze Age. The failure of the trade routes didn't just spell economic decline. It was the catalyst for a societal collapse that rippled across the ancient world. In their desperation, civilizations were faced with an uncomfortable reality. They had no choice but to adapt or perish. And in the midst of this collapse, something unexpected began to happen. As bronze became harder and harder to obtain, an alternative emerged. It was not an easy solution, nor was it a quick one. But the ancient world, ever resilient in its pursuit of survival, discovered iron. Iron was plentiful. Unlike tin, which had to be sourced from distant, often unstable locations, iron was found in abundance throughout the ancient world. From the bogs of Scandinavia to the rich iron ore deposits of Central Europe, this new resource could be harnessed by communities much closer to home. No longer did the world depend on the long, fragile supply chains that had once sustained it. Iron was a new beginning, born out of the ashes of the old world. But the rise of iron was not an immediate or easy solution. While it was abundant, it was far from simple to work with. Iron does not have the same malleability as bronze, and early attempts at smelting and forging iron were crude at best. The process was slow, requiring immense skill and knowledge. Unlike bronze, which could be easily cast into intricate shapes, iron had to be carefully manipulated and forged through intense heat and repeated hammering. But the potential was there. As the civilizations of the ancient world scrambled to adapt, iron began to emerge as the material that would define the new age. This transition was nothing short of revolutionary. The shift from bronze to iron changed the very fabric of society. Iron, unlike its predecessor, was not the exclusive domain of a few. Bronze had been a precious, expensive material that required specialized trade routes and was often hoarded by the elite. Iron, however, was a more democratic resource. It was available to more people, to more communities. It was no longer necessary to rely on the elite's control of precious metals. Iron allowed for the creation of tools and weapons in larger quantities, and it empowered even the smallest communities to become self-sufficient. This was a shift not just in material culture, but in the very social structure of these societies. Iron changed everything: agriculture, warfare, and trade. The use of iron in farming tools made the land more productive, turning barren soils into fertile fields. The plough, the axe, the sickle, all these tools made of iron revolutionized agriculture, leading to greater food production and, in turn, population growth. The ability to cultivate more land meant that people could settle in new areas, establishing communities where there had once been nothing but wilderness. It was the birth of a new kind of society, one that was no longer dependent on trade but could stand on its own. In warfare, iron gave the people of this new world a distinct advantage. The weapons forged from iron were stronger, sharper, and more durable than their bronze predecessors. Spears, swords, shields, all of these were now made of iron, and they gave their wielders an edge in battle. Iron weapons were not just more effective, they were more abundant. They were cheaper to produce, and they could be mass-produced in ways that bronze weapons could not. The people who had access to iron could now challenge their enemies with a power they had never known before. Iron also brought about a transformation in trade. While the ancient world had once relied on the complex and far-reaching networks of commerce that connected distant civilizations, the collapse of these systems had forced societies to look inward to develop local resources and self-sufficiency. Iron, abundant and versatile, became the foundation for these new systems. The demand for iron for tools, weapons, and implements led to the development of local iron industries. No longer did people have to rely on distant, fragile trade routes to obtain the materials they needed. They could forge their own future with iron as their key. As the world moved away from the dependency on bronze, a new era began to take shape. Iron was not just a new material, it was a symbol of resilience. It was a symbol of humanity's ability to adapt in the face of crisis. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, marked by the fall of trade routes and the scarcity of vital resources, could have led to the end of human progress. But instead, it sparked the beginning of a new era, and this era would be defined by iron that was plentiful, iron that was strong, and iron that would build the foundations of the next great civilizations. The shift from bronze to iron was a slow and difficult process, but it was one that allowed humanity to rise from the ashes of the old world. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the story of civilization. And as we look at the challenges we face today, the technological disruptions, the environmental crises, the political instability, we must remember the lesson of the past. Change, even when it is born out of catastrophe, can lead to something greater. The world we live in today was shaped by the transformation that came from the collapse of the Bronze Age. The societies that survived adapted, found new solutions, and rebuilt in ways that were stronger, more resilient, and more connected. And so too can we. The collapse of trade routes, the scarcity of vital resources, and the rise of iron. These were not just the challenges of the past. They are the challenges of every civilization, every people, and every era. What matters is how we respond. How will we adapt to the challenges of our time? How will we rise from the collapse of the old world and build something new? The answer lies in our ability to innovate, to embrace change, and to forge our own path forward, just as the ancient world did with the rise of iron. As the world transitioned from bronze to iron, it wasn't just a technological shift, it was a cultural transformation. The collapse of the trade routes and the collapse of the interconnected networks that had once held these ancient civilizations together catalyzed a profound change. What began as a struggle for survival amidst scarcity gradually evolved into a force that reshaped human society. The advent of iron signified not just the replacement of one metal with another, but a dramatic shift in how societies thought, lived, and functioned. In the face of loss and destruction, societies were not merely rebuilding, they were reinventing themselves. With the collapse of long-distance trade routes, each community was forced to become self-reliant. No longer could they depend on distant lands for precious materials. No longer could they rely on the fragile trade routes that once connected them to other prosperous civilizations. This shift prompted a re-evaluation of the old ways, forcing people to develop local systems of resource management, production, and exchange. Iron, being more abundant and easier to work with than bronze, allowed people to forge their own future, giving rise to more localized and sustainable systems of industry and trade. Iron also gave birth to new forms of social and economic organization. Bronze had been a material controlled by the elite, the rulers, merchants, and aristocrats who controlled the trade routes and the distribution of precious metals. But with iron, the material became more widely accessible. The democratization of iron allowed even small villages and remote communities to participate in the production of tools, weapons, and household goods. In many ways, iron leveled the playing field, offering opportunities to communities that had once been sidelined by the scarcity of bronze. This brought about a profound shift in the social structure, where previously marginalized groups began to have more agency in shaping their communities and their futures. Furthermore, the transition to iron didn't just revolutionize tools and weapons, it transformed how people viewed their world. With the creation of iron tools and farming equipment, agricultural production skyrocketed. The iron plow allowed farmers to till deeper, richer soils that had once been unworkable. Iron sickles made harvesting faster and more efficient, increasing crop yields and supporting larger populations. As food production increased, so too did the ability for people to settle in new regions, forming new villages and cities. The growing population needed more food, more shelter, more resources. In many ways, iron became the backbone of a new economy, one based on self-sufficiency, local production, and agricultural innovation. Iron's impact on warfare was equally profound. The new metal allowed for the mass production of weapons that were stronger and more durable than their bronze counterparts. Swords, spears, shields, and armor made from iron revolutionized the way armies fought. These iron weapons gave warriors an edge in battle that was unmatched by bronze. Moreover, the fact that iron could be produced more easily and in larger quantities meant that it was no longer just the elites who had access to superior weaponry. Iron leveled the playing field on the battlefield, empowering small kingdoms and tribes to challenge larger, more established empires. The emergence of iron also had far-reaching consequences for trade. While the collapse of long-distance trade routes initially led to a period of isolation, it also pushed communities to find new ways to connect. The demand for iron and iron products led to the establishment of local industries and regional trade networks. What was once a global, interconnected system of exchange became a more localized form of commerce, as societies sought out iron ore, developed their own iron production, and traded among themselves for the goods they needed. It was a transformation in the way people thought about production and exchange, moving away from reliance on distant empires to a more localized and independent economy. The rise of iron was not simply a technological shift, it was a symbol of resilience. In the face of the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, when the old systems were no longer viable, iron provided a new foundation for survival. It was a material born out of necessity and adversity. Iron gave people the tools to adapt, to survive, and to thrive in a world that had been broken by war, famine, and the collapse of the old order. This new era, marked by iron, would define the trajectory of human civilization for centuries to come. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, while devastating, set the stage for the rise of new empires, new cultures, and new ways of thinking. Just as the people of the ancient world faced a dramatic shift in their circumstances, so too do we find ourselves in an era of great change. Today, we face challenges that echo those of the past: technological disruption, environmental crises, and shifting global power dynamics. In many ways, we too are at a crossroads, forced to adapt and reinvent ourselves in order to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing world. The story of the Bronze Age collapse and the rise of iron teaches us that out of destruction comes creation. It shows us that even in the darkest times, when the systems we depend on seem to be falling apart, there is always the potential for renewal. Iron, a material born out of crisis, transformed the ancient world. And so, too, can the challenges we face today spark the innovation and resilience necessary to forge a new future. As we move forward into this new era, we must remember the lessons of the past. We must embrace change, adapt to new realities, and harness the transformative power of new technologies and ideas. Just as iron shaped the world that came after the Bronze Age collapse, so too can the innovations of today shape the world that will come after us. The key to survival and to thriving in a rapidly changing world lies in our ability to innovate, to adapt, and to build new systems that will carry us into the future. Just as iron became the foundation of the Iron Age, so too must we forge our own future with the materials at hand. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was not the end of civilization itself, but the beginning of something new. The end of one world was the birth of another, more resilient and adaptable world. And now, it's our turn to rise from the ashes of the old and create a new world that can withstand the challenges of the future. As the dust settled over the once mighty civilizations of the Bronze Age, the world stood at a precipice. Entire empires had crumbled, their great cities and trade routes reduced to ruins. The old ways, the old systems, and the old orders of the ancient world had shattered, leaving only fractured remnants. What followed was not simply a period of decay, but one of transition, adaptation, and, ultimately, rebirth. The collapse of the Bronze Age brought an era of unimaginable hardship, but it also carried within it the seed of something new, a transformation that would shape the course of human history for centuries to come. This was the turning point. A world that had once relied on the fragile networks of commerce, intricate technologies, and centralized power structures now had to find new ways to survive. With the loss of established systems came the opportunity for change. The ancient world had always been defined by its dependence on trade and resources that came from distant lands. Now, with the destruction of these trade routes, societies were forced to look inward. They could no longer depend on far-flung suppliers of bronze, tin, or precious materials. The old world, with its long-distance exchanges and complex political relationships, was gone. What was left was a much smaller, localized world that had to learn how to adapt and rebuild. And adapt they did. The transition was neither smooth nor immediate. The collapse of entire civilizations often leads to a loss of knowledge, a break in the continuous progress that had been made. The once advanced techniques, the knowledge of trade, and the cultural achievements of the Bronze Age societies seemed to fade into the background. There was no easy path forward, no blueprint for survival. The societies that remained had no choice but to find new methods of sustenance, new technologies, and new forms of governance. It was a moment of crisis, but also a moment of immense potential. In the rubble of the old world, a new age began to emerge, the Iron Age. Iron, which had once been a scarce and exotic material, became the foundation for the new era. The shift from bronze to iron was more than just a technological change. It was a cultural and societal shift. Iron represented the resilience of humanity, the ability to adapt to the challenges posed by the collapse. It was a metal born out of necessity, and it became the symbol of human ingenuity in the face of adversity. Iron was not just a replacement for bronze, it was something entirely new. It was more abundant, more versatile, and, most importantly, it was a material that could be produced locally. This change was not immediate, nor was it easy. Iron required a different set of skills to work with. It was harder to forge and shape than bronze, and it required intense heat to be manipulated. But as the people of the ancient world slowly mastered the process of ironworking, they began to see the vast potential it offered. With iron, societies could rebuild in ways that were not possible with bronze. Iron tools and weapons were stronger and more durable. They could be mass-produced in ways that bronze could not. And this mass production of iron didn't just benefit the elite, it empowered entire communities. Iron was a more democratic resource, one that could be used by all levels of society, from farmers to blacksmiths to warriors. It was a resource that allowed for the creation of more sustainable, self-sufficient communities. In warfare, iron gave rise to a new kind of military power. Iron swords, shields, and spears replaced their bronze counterparts, making armies more formidable. Iron weapons could be mass-produced, and as more and more people learned to wield them, the balance of power shifted. No longer were the great empires of the Bronze Age the only players on the world stage. Small tribes, once overshadowed by the might of empires, now had the power to challenge their neighbours. The rise of iron marked the beginning of a new age of military prowess, one that would redefine the way battles were fought. But the transformation wasn't limited to warfare. Iron also had a profound impact on agriculture. With iron ploughs, farmers could till the soil more efficiently, opening up new lands for cultivation. Iron sickles allowed for faster and more effective harvesting, leading to greater food production and the growth of populations. The ability to produce more food meant that people could settle in previously uninhabitable areas, establishing new villages and cities. This marked the beginning of a new pattern of settlement, one that was based on the local production of resources rather than the distant trade of goods. In the absence of long-distance trade, societies began to rely more heavily on local industries. Iron became a driving force behind the development of new technologies and local economies. People no longer needed to depend on the fragile, now defunct trade networks of the Bronze Age. Instead, they turned to their own resources, iron, wood, and stone, to rebuild and create new systems of living. These new systems were often less centralized than those of the Bronze Age, more decentralized and self-sufficient, with local craftsmen, farmers, and warriors taking on more importance in the structure of society. This period of transformation was not just about survival, it was about innovation. The collapse of the old world forced societies to rethink everything: their social structures, their economies, and their technologies. With the rise of iron, ancient peoples found new ways of doing things. The materials that had once been rare and valuable were now abundant. The societies that embraced this change were able to rebuild their economies and their cultures in ways that had not been possible before. But this rebirth was not without its struggles. The people of the Iron Age faced immense challenges, from the difficulty of mastering ironworking to the need to reorganize their societies and economies. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations had left behind not only physical ruins but cultural and psychological scars. The old ways had been destroyed, and the new world was still taking shape. There was no certainty about the future, only the hard work and resilience of those who survived. Yet, in this time of upheaval, humanity found strength. The Iron Age was born not just from the ruins of the past, but from the unyielding will of people determined to rebuild. It was a time of trial, error, and reinvention. It was a time when societies learned to adapt to their new circumstances and create something that would stand the test of time. This transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age marked the beginning of a new world. It was a world that was defined by resilience, innovation, and the ability to adapt in the face of collapse. And as we look at our own world today, a world facing its own set of challenges, from environmental destruction to political instability, we can draw inspiration from the ancient world. Just as the Bronze Age civilizations were forced to adapt to new realities, we too must find ways to rebuild and reshape our world. We must look at the collapse of the old systems and use it as an opportunity to create something better, something more sustainable, and something more resilient. The collapse of the Bronze Age world may have seemed like the end of civilization, but in reality, it was just the beginning of a new age, one that would be defined by iron. And so, the story of the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations teaches us that even in the darkest times, there is always the potential for rebirth. Even when everything seems to be falling apart, new possibilities can emerge. The challenges we face today, no matter how daunting, carry within them the potential for transformation. Like the ancient world, we too can find a way to adapt, to innovate, and to rise from the ashes of the past. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations marked a profound moment in human history. It was a time of upheaval and destruction, yet it also held the promise of renewal. The world that had been defined by intricate trade networks, powerful empires, and the mastery of bronze now lay in ruins. And in the wake of this cataclysm, a new world began to take shape, a world defined by the rise of iron. Iron was not just a new material, it was a symbol of humanity's resilience. It emerged at a time when the old ways were no longer viable. The collapse of the Bronze Age had torn apart the systems of trade and power that had sustained ancient societies. Cities, once vibrant centers of culture, now lay abandoned. The great roads of commerce were blocked, and the once thriving trade routes that linked distant lands from Egypt to the Levant, from Mycenae to Hattusa, ceased to function. The loss of these trade routes sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world, breaking the delicate balance that had held it all together. With these systems of exchange shattered, people had to look inward. They could no longer rely on far-flung suppliers for the materials they needed to survive. The metal that had defined an entire era, bronze, was now in short supply, leaving people to search for new resources. But from this crisis came opportunity. Iron, a material that had been used sparingly in the past, was abundant and waiting to be tapped. Unlike bronze, which required the combination of tin and copper, both of which were hard to come by, iron was more accessible and could be found in many places across the ancient world. From the bogs of Scandinavia to the rich deposits of iron ore in Central Europe, iron was waiting to be discovered, and when it was, it became the material that would reshape everything. The rise of iron was not instantaneous, nor was it without struggle. Early attempts at working with iron were difficult. Unlike bronze, which could be easily cast into molds, iron had to be carefully forged at higher temperatures, requiring specialized skills and knowledge. The process of smelting and shaping iron was slow, labor-intensive, and often failed. Yet, this challenge only served to drive innovation. Ironworking required new techniques and a deeper understanding of the material, and over time, people learned how to unlock its potential. The transition from bronze to iron marked a turning point, not just in metallurgy, but in human history. Iron was a versatile, abundant material, and it symbolized the resilience of humanity to adapt to and overcome the challenges of its time. As the ancient world moved from bronze to iron, it wasn't just about the materials, it was about the shift in societal structures that came with it. Bronze had been a precious resource, often controlled by the elite, and its production and distribution were tied to complex trade networks. But iron was different. It was far more abundant, and its use was not limited to the powerful or the wealthy. Iron tools, weapons, and implements could be produced locally, and this democratization of resources empowered entire communities. It allowed people to forge their own tools, to arm themselves, and to create the foundation for self-sufficient societies. In essence, iron gave people the power to rebuild, to recreate the world on their own terms. The effects of iron went beyond the individual and the community. They extended to the entire course of civilization. Warfare, agriculture, and trade were all transformed by the rise of iron. In warfare, iron weapons, swords, shields, spears were stronger and more durable than bronze. They could be mass-produced, making them more widely accessible. The small, independent communities that had once been vulnerable to larger empires now had the means to defend themselves. They could challenge the great powers of the past, using iron weapons to compete on an even footing. The rise of iron in military technology redefined the balance of power, shifting the focus away from centralized empires and toward decentralized, self-reliant communities. In agriculture, iron had an equally profound impact. The iron plough allowed farmers to cultivate land that had once been deemed unfit for farming. Iron tools from axes to sickles revolutionized the way people worked the land. With these new tools, agriculture became more efficient, leading to increased food production. And with increased food production came population growth. People could now settle in new areas, expanding into previously uninhabited territories. Villages and cities began to form again, not based on trade and external resources, but on local production and self-sufficiency. This marked the beginning of a new form of societal organization, one that was more localized and sustainable. Iron also transformed trade, but in a different way. While the collapse of the old trade networks had initially led to a period of isolation, the rise of iron allowed for the development of new local industries and regional trade networks. People no longer had to rely on distant suppliers for materials. Iron was something they could produce themselves, and with it, they began to build new economies. Iron allowed for local industries to flourish, from blacksmiths to farmers to traders. It was the foundation of a new kind of commerce, one that was based on self-sufficiency rather than the long-distance exchange of goods. As a result, the old systems of trade were replaced by new forms of local, regional, and even national trade, with iron at the heart of it all. But the transition to iron was not without its challenges. It required a shift in thinking, a departure from the old world of bronze, and an embrace of something new and uncertain. The collapse of the Bronze Age had left societies reeling, uncertain of what would come next. And yet, out of this chaos, a new world began to take shape, one that was built on the resilience and adaptability of human beings. The collapse had forced societies to rethink their priorities and to find new ways of living. It had forced them to innovate, to experiment, and to discover the potential of new materials. Iron, in many ways, represented this new era, one defined by the strength and resilience of human ingenuity. As the new Iron Age began, societies slowly rebuilt themselves, drawing on the lessons of the past while embracing the opportunities of the future. Iron, which had once been a rare and exotic material, became the foundation for a new world. The societies that embraced iron found new ways of thinking, new ways of living, and new ways of interacting with the world around them. Iron was the key to their survival, but it was also the key to their success. It allowed them to rebuild, to reinvent, and to create a new age, an age defined by the strength, versatility, and resilience of iron. And as we look at the world today, we can draw lessons from the past. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations taught us that even in the darkest times, there is always the potential for rebirth. The challenges we face today, whether they be political, environmental, or technological, may seem insurmountable. But like the civilizations of the past, we too can find new ways to adapt, to innovate, and to rise from the ashes of the old world. Just as iron became the foundation for a new world in the past, so too can we find the tools we need to build a new future. The collapse of the old systems may feel like the end, but in reality, it is just the beginning of something new. The story of the ancient world, particularly the rise of iron and its impact on civilizations, holds within it not just a tale of technological advancement, but also one of profound cultural transformation. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was a moment of immense loss and upheaval, but it also sparked a revolution that would change the course of history forever. The emergence of iron wasn't just a shift in material culture, it was a pivotal turning point in the human experience, altering how societies interacted with their environments, each other, and the world they knew. It was a revolution that defined the dawn of a new age, one that would set the stage for future generations. Iron was not simply an alternative to bronze, it was a new way of understanding the world. It was an abundant and accessible resource, but it demanded a new level of ingenuity to harness its full potential. The societies that survived the collapse of the Bronze Age were faced with a choice: to adapt to the changing world or risk becoming another footnote in the annals of history. In the wake of destruction, these civilizations found themselves not only rebuilding their material world, but also rethinking their social, cultural, and economic systems. The transition to iron was as much about survival as it was about innovation. The collapse of the Bronze Age world wasn't just the fall of a few great empires, it was the unraveling of an entire interconnected system. The trade routes that once linked great civilizations, bringing tin from far-flung regions and bronze to distant shores, were severed. In their place arose a world that was smaller, more isolated, and, for a time, uncertain. But it was within this new world that iron found its place. It was no longer confined to the realm of rarity or luxury. Iron was a material that could be found in abundance, from the rich deposits of the Near East to the bogs of Scandinavia. It became the foundation for rebuilding a material that could be forged by almost anyone, anywhere, at any time. For those ancient societies that turned to iron, the transformation was not instant. The first iron tools were not immediately better than bronze. They required far more skill to produce and were not as easily shaped. Yet, the potential of iron was undeniable. Slowly, through trial and error, iron working techniques began to improve. Iron smelting required a new kind of furnace, one that could reach the higher temperatures necessary for transforming raw ore into usable metal. The process was labor-intensive, but it held the promise of a new future, a future in which tools, weapons, and everyday implements could be mass-produced and more widely distributed. It was a world where the availability of iron meant that survival was no longer dependent on the fragility of trade routes or the control of precious materials. The rise of iron marked the beginning of an era that would be defined by both its potential and its challenges. In warfare, the use of iron weapons transformed military tactics. The durability and effectiveness of iron swords, spears, and shields gave armies a new kind of advantage. Iron was stronger than bronze, and its mass production allowed for the creation of larger and more formidable forces. This shift in military technology was not just about the weapons themselves, but about the power they bestowed upon those who wielded them. Iron empowered smaller communities and allowed them to challenge larger empires. It gave rise to a new kind of military power, one that would define the future of warfare for centuries. But the impact of iron was not confined to the battlefield. It spread to every facet of life. In agriculture, iron plows allowed farmers to till the land more efficiently, opening up new territories for cultivation. Iron tools, from axes to sickles, revolutionized the way people worked the earth. For the first time in history, people were able to cultivate more land, grow more food, and support larger populations. This shift in agriculture had profound implications for society. As food production increased, so did the ability to support larger settlements and growing populations. Entire villages and cities began to emerge in places that had once been uninhabitable. The rise of iron had created a new way of life, one in which people could live and thrive independently, without relying on the fragile systems of trade and commerce that had defined the Bronze Age. The economic implications of iron were also far-reaching. With the collapse of the old trade networks, societies had to become self-sufficient. The demand for iron tools, weapons, and agricultural implements sparked the growth of local industries. As iron began to replace bronze, it gave rise to new forms of craftsmanship and innovation. Local blacksmiths and metalworkers became the heart of these new economies, providing the tools and technologies necessary for survival and growth. The rise of iron also led to the development of new trade networks, ones that were more localized and decentralized. The old system of long-distance trade that had connected Egypt to Greece and the Levant was replaced by a more self-sustaining system, in which communities could trade locally, produced iron goods and services. But iron also created new social dynamics. The material itself was abundant, but the skills required to forge it were not. Ironworking became a specialized craft, and those who possessed the knowledge and expertise to work with iron were highly valued in their communities. In some ways, the rise of iron led to a democratization of power, as more people had access to the tools and resources they needed to survive and prosper. Ironworking allowed for a more decentralized society, where power was distributed among local artisans, farmers, and warriors, rather than concentrated in the hands of a few elites. However, the rise of iron also brought with it new challenges. The transition from bronze to iron was not a smooth one. It required a significant shift in thinking and in technology. The old world, with its reliance on trade and the control of rare materials, was gone, and in its place a new world emerged, one that was smaller, more localized, and more dependent on local resources. The societies that survived the collapse of the Bronze Age had to reinvent themselves. They had to find new ways of living, new ways of working, and new ways of relating to one another. This was a time of profound change, but it was also a time of great opportunity. The collapse of the old systems had left societies vulnerable, but it had also created the conditions for innovation. Iron, a material once reserved for the few, became the foundation for a new world. It was a world defined by resilience, adaptability, and the ability to thrive in the face of uncertainty. The collapse of the Bronze Age had marked the end of an era, but it had also opened the door to a new beginning, one that would be defined by the strength, versatility, and accessibility of iron. Iron became the material that allowed ancient societies to rebuild and reinvent themselves. It was the foundation for a new world, one that would be defined by local production, self-sufficiency, and innovation. And just as the rise of iron reshaped the ancient world, so too can we learn from its lessons today. In times of crisis, when old systems break down and uncertainty prevails, the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to embrace new possibilities is what enables societies to rise from the ashes and create something stronger, more resilient, and more enduring. The story of the rise of iron is not just the story of a metal, it is the story of human resilience and the ability to build anew. It is a story that continues to resonate today as we face our own challenges and opportunities. And just as iron forged the future of the ancient world, so too can we forge our own future with the tools we have at hand. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, and this chapter, marked by the rise of iron, would lay the foundation for the societies, cultures, and empires that would shape the future. It was a world born from the ashes of the old, a world where the possibilities were endless, and the future, though uncertain, held the promise of transformation. As iron began to take center stage, a profound shift occurred in the way people viewed their world. The collapse of the Bronze Age left many societies without the sophisticated systems that had once held them together. Trade routes were destroyed, empires fell, and the intricate web of culture and commerce was torn apart. In the face of such devastating loss, humanity was forced to adapt, to innovate, and to rebuild from the ground up. But iron, more than just a metal, became a symbol of this transformation. It was the foundation upon which new civilizations were built, a material that offered both opportunity and a new way of thinking. Iron, unlike bronze, was not a rare material. It was abundant and could be sourced from nearby areas, making it accessible to a wide range of communities. This availability was a game changer. In the Bronze Age, only the wealthy elites had the means to control and distribute precious materials like tin and copper, which were necessary for the production of bronze. But iron, as an abundant resource, allowed for the creation of a more equitable society. People no longer needed to rely on the whims of distant rulers or fragile trade networks. They could forge their own future with this new material. However, the shift from bronze to iron was not a seamless transition. The process of working with iron was far more difficult and complex than working with bronze. It required new tools, new methods, and a deep understanding of metallurgy. The early days of ironworking were filled with trial and error, as craftsmen struggled to master the techniques necessary to turn iron ore into usable metal. The metal was harder to shape and forge than bronze, and the methods used for smelting were far more advanced. But as time passed, societies learned how to harness the full potential of iron, and its uses began to expand far beyond the military and agricultural realms. The military impact of iron was immediate and profound. Iron weapons were stronger, more durable, and easier to produce than their bronze counterparts. Iron swords, spears, and shields replaced bronze ones, giving armies a much-needed edge in battle. As iron became more widespread, small, independent communities, once at the mercy of larger empires, could now arm themselves and defend their lands. No longer was power solely in the hands of a few large kingdoms. Iron had democratized warfare, and with it, the balance of power shifted. Smaller tribes, once powerless against the might of great empires, could now fight back. The rise of iron marked the birth of a new era of military warfare, one defined by the mass production of weapons and the ability of smaller factions to challenge the status quo. The rise of iron didn't just reshape the battlefield, however. It had far-reaching effects on agriculture and society as well. With the advent of iron ploughs, farmers could now cultivate land more efficiently. The iron plough, stronger and more durable than its wooden predecessors, allowed people to open up new areas for cultivation, turning previously barren land into fertile soil. This revolution in agriculture had a domino effect. With more food to feed growing populations, settlements expanded and cities began to emerge in places where they hadn't been possible before. Iron tools, from axes to sickles, made harvesting more efficient, which in turn allowed people to cultivate larger amounts of crops. This led to the growth of larger, more stable communities, and by extension, the rise of new civilizations. Iron didn't just rebuild societies. It allowed them to flourish in ways that bronze never could. The economic implications of the rise of iron were profound as well. In the wake of the collapse of the Bronze Age trade routes, societies had to become more self-sufficient. Iron, a material that could be sourced locally, became the cornerstone of local industries. Ironworking, once a skill reserved for a few, became essential to every community. Blacksmiths and metalworkers, who were once few and far between, became central figures in society. As the demand for iron tools, weapons, and agricultural implements grew, the economy began to shift. Local iron industries grew, and trade networks, though smaller than those of the Bronze Age, began to form around iron production. It was a shift from the globalized trade of the Bronze Age to more localized, self-sufficient economies. Iron also brought about a cultural shift. The societies that embraced iron were not simply rebuilding their cities and economies, they were reinventing their cultures. Iron empowered the common people, not just the elites. This democratization of resources gave rise to new social dynamics. Blacksmiths and ironworkers were no longer just craftsmen. They were the lifeblood of society. The ability to forge iron tools, weapons, and implements was no longer confined to a select few. As iron became more widespread, so too did the ability for ordinary people to become artisans, warriors, and farmers. Iron allowed for the creation of a new social order, one in which power and wealth were no longer concentrated in the hands of a few elites, but were spread more equally among communities. However, the transition to an iron-based world wasn't without its difficulties. The collapse of the old systems and the rise of new ones meant that there was no certainty about the future. Societies had to reinvent not only their economies, but also their cultures and ways of life. The new world was smaller, more localized, and less interconnected than the old one. The collapse of long-distance trade routes and the rise of local economies meant that people had to find new ways to sustain themselves, and that required innovation. The societies that survived the collapse of the Bronze Age had to embrace the opportunities that iron provided, but they also had to be resilient in the face of adversity. The rise of iron was not just a technological advancement, it was a cultural transformation. It was a symbol of the ability of humanity to adapt to its circumstances, to rebuild and reinvent itself in the face of disaster. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations could have been the end of civilization as a whole, but instead it marked the beginning of a new era, one defined by resilience, innovation, and adaptability. Looking back at the rise of iron, we can see how the collapse of the old world gave birth to something new. Iron was the key to rebuilding societies, to creating new economies and new forms of governance. And in many ways, the story of the rise of iron mirrors our own modern struggles. Today, we face our own challenges: environmental destruction, political instability, and social upheaval. But just as iron allowed the ancient world to adapt and thrive in the face of collapse, so too can we find ways to build a more resilient, sustainable, and prosperous future. The story of the rise of iron is a reminder that, in times of crisis, there is always the potential for transformation. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. It was a chapter defined by the strength, versatility, and resilience of iron, a material that allowed humanity to rise from the ashes and build a new world. And as we look to the future, we must remember that, just like iron, we have the tools to rebuild and create something stronger, more resilient, and more enduring. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations did not just create a void in the physical world, but in the collective psyche of the people. It was a cataclysmic event that shattered centuries of progress and interconnectedness, bringing the once mighty world to its knees. And yet, it is often in moments of profound loss that human beings are pushed to their greatest heights of creativity and resilience. The collapse was not simply the end of an era, it was the birth of something entirely new, a redefinition of the future that would come to define the next great age, the Iron Age. In this age of transition, iron was not simply a metal, it was a symbol of the human ability to adapt, to transform adversity into opportunity. Where bronze had once been the foundation of civilization, iron became the cornerstone of survival and progress. For those who remained after the fall of the Bronze Age, iron was more than a material. It was the tool that would help them rebuild their world. It represented a new way forward, one that would allow for the creation of new societies, new structures, and new forms of life that were no longer reliant on the fragile trade routes or the elites who controlled them. The transition to the Iron Age was not immediate, nor was it simple. The shift from bronze to iron was a radical departure, a leap into the unknown. Societies that had once depended on the sophisticated trade networks that crisscrossed the Mediterranean found themselves cut off, stranded in a world where resources were scarce and the knowledge of how to forge iron was limited. It was a world in chaos, one that was slowly rebuilding itself from the ground up. But where there was chaos, there was also the seed of innovation, and it was this seed that would give rise to the Iron Age. Iron, unlike bronze, was abundant and could be found in many places. From the bogs of Scandinavia to the rich iron deposits in Central Europe, iron was everywhere, a material that could be shaped and used by nearly anyone, not just the elite. It was a democratizing force, one that did not require long-distance trade or the control of rare resources. Iron allowed entire communities to become self-sufficient, to forge their own destiny without having to rely on distant and often unreliable supply chains. The very abundance of iron meant that it could be produced locally, in virtually every community, from small villages to emerging city-states. It was a material that put power back into the hands of the people, allowing them to reclaim their agency in a world that had been thrown into disarray. Yet, despite its abundance, iron was not without its challenges. It required new skills, new methods, and new ways of thinking. The techniques for smelting and forging iron were not immediately obvious, and it took centuries for the people of the Iron Age to develop the necessary technology to make iron an effective replacement for bronze. Early attempts at working with iron were crude, and the first iron tools and weapons were often less effective than their bronze counterparts. Ironworking required a higher degree of heat and precision, and it demanded that people not only adapt their tools, but also their entire way of thinking about craftsmanship. The transition was difficult, slow, and fraught with trial and error, but the potential of iron was undeniable. Slowly, the techniques for forging iron improved, and ironworking began to evolve into a sophisticated craft. By learning to manipulate iron through repeated heating, hammering, and shaping, societies discovered that iron could be turned into tools and weapons that were not only functional, but superior to bronze in many ways. Iron was stronger, more durable, and more versatile. The shift from bronze to iron marked a turning point in human history, as it provided a foundation for new technologies, new economies, and new ways of life. Iron, once a rare commodity, became the backbone of the societies that would emerge from the ashes of the Bronze Age. The rise of iron also marked a profound shift in the balance of power. No longer were societies reliant on the fragile trade networks that had sustained them in the past. Iron was a resource that could be controlled locally, and with it, the power to create and sustain armies, build infrastructure, and fuel the engines of progress. In warfare, iron gave rise to a new kind of military power. Iron weapons, such as swords, spears, and shields, were stronger and more durable than their bronze counterparts. They could be mass-produced, and their availability allowed smaller, less powerful communities to arm themselves and defend their lands. The democratization of iron in military technology meant that no longer would the great empires of the Bronze Age hold a monopoly on power. Smaller tribes, once relegated to the margins, now had the ability to challenge the larger, more established kingdoms. The rise of iron marked the beginning of a new age of warfare, one where local communities could compete with the might of the empires. But the rise of iron was not just about military power. It also had a profound impact on agriculture. The introduction of iron ploughs allowed farmers to till the soil more efficiently, opening up new territories for cultivation. Iron tools such as sickles and axes made harvesting crops faster and more effective, leading to greater food production and the ability to support larger populations. The increased availability of iron enabled societies to produce more food, which in turn led to population growth and the establishment of new settlements. In the wake of the collapse of the Bronze Age, iron became the foundation for the creation of new, self-sustaining communities that could thrive without relying on the long-distance trade routes that had once connected the ancient world. The economic implications of the rise of iron were profound. As societies turned inward, developing more localized economies, iron became the cornerstone of these new systems. The demand for iron tools, weapons, and agricultural implements sparked the growth of local industries and the development of new trade networks. Local blacksmiths, metalworkers, and farmers became the backbone of these new economies, providing the tools and technologies necessary for survival and growth. The old systems of trade and commerce, which had been so central to the Bronze Age, were replaced by smaller, more self-sufficient networks. Iron, as a versatile and abundant resource, allowed societies to rebuild their economies and their way of life without depending on distant and fragile trade routes. The rise of iron also brought with it a shift in social dynamics. Ironworking, while accessible, still required specialized knowledge and skill. Those who mastered the art of working with iron became highly valued members of their communities. In this way, the rise of iron contributed to the democratization of power. The material itself was abundant, but the knowledge required to work it was not. Ironworking became a specialized craft, and those who possessed the skills to forge iron tools, weapons, and implements became central figures in their communities. This shift in the distribution of power was significant. The rise of iron allowed for a more decentralized society, where power was distributed more widely among local artisans, farmers, and warriors, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a few elites. Yet, even as iron brought about this new world of opportunity, it also brought new challenges. The collapse of the Bronze Age had left societies vulnerable, and the rise of iron required new ways of thinking, new technologies, and new forms of governance. The world was no longer the same. It was smaller, more isolated, and more dependent on local resources. Societies had to adapt, to innovate, and to find new ways of living, working, and relating to one another. But in this time of upheaval, there was also immense potential for growth and transformation. Iron, more than just a replacement for bronze, became a symbol of human resilience. It represented the ability to adapt to crisis, to overcome adversity, and to rebuild in the face of destruction. The collapse of the Bronze Age could have been the end of civilization as a whole, but instead, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Iron allowed humanity to rebuild its world, to create new technologies, new forms of governance, and new ways of life. The story of iron is not just the story of a metal, it is the story of human ingenuity, adaptability, and the relentless drive to survive and thrive in a changing world. Looking back at the rise of iron, we see not just a technological advancement, but a cultural transformation. Iron marked the beginning of a new era, an era defined by resilience, innovation, and adaptability. The societies that embraced iron found new ways of living and new ways of thinking, and in doing so, they laid the foundation for the future. As we face our own challenges today, whether they are political, environmental, or technological, we can draw strength from the ancient world. Just as the rise of iron changed the course of history, so too can we shape our own future with the tools we have at hand. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by the rise of iron, a material that would shape the future of humanity. In the same way, the challenges we face today are not the end. They are the beginning of a new chapter, one in which we can adapt, innovate, and rise from the ashes of the past to build something stronger, more resilient, and more enduring. The rise of iron not only marked a turning point in the physical and technological landscape of the ancient world, but also instigated a cultural renaissance that transcended the material. Iron became not just a tool, but a symbol of the ancient world's resilience, a testament to humanity's ability to adapt and rebuild in the face of unimaginable upheaval. With iron, civilizations were no longer bound by the limitations of fragile trade routes and scarce resources. Iron was plentiful, and societies that embraced its potential were able to reshape their economies, military power, and social structures in ways that seemed impossible only a generation before. The vast trade networks that had once connected the Bronze Age world were gone, but this collapse allowed for the emergence of localized economies that were more self-sufficient. Communities, once dependent on distant supply chains, now had the ability to forge their own destiny. The local availability of iron meant that people did not have to rely on the unstable supply of precious metals. They could produce tools, weapons, and everyday implements without leaving their homes. This newfound independence gave rise to a more decentralized world, where local artisans, blacksmiths, and farmers held newfound power within their communities. This was a significant departure from the hierarchical, centralized control that characterized the Bronze Age, where the elites controlled access to the most valuable resources. With iron, the balance of power shifted. In warfare, iron allowed smaller, once-ignored tribes to stand toe-to-toe with the empires that had once dominated the landscape. Iron weapons were cheaper to produce than bronze, which meant that armies could be raised in greater numbers. The availability of iron democratized military power, allowing those without vast resources to equip themselves and challenge the more established powers. This shift in power dynamics changed the nature of warfare and the rise of civilizations. It signaled the beginning of a new chapter, where might was no longer solely reserved for the powerful few, but could be wielded by the many. Beyond the battlefield, the rise of iron also revolutionized agriculture. The increased efficiency of iron plows allowed for the cultivation of previously unusable land, which led to the growth of settlements. With iron tools, farmers could work the land more effectively, producing more food for expanding populations. These advancements helped sustain growing societies and provided the foundation for new cities to arise. In this new world, the Iron Age brought about a self-sufficiency that allowed people to grow and expand without the need for external resources. Entire communities flourished as they moved away from dependence on long-distance trade and towards localized industry, agriculture, and craftsmanship. Socially, the transformation brought about by iron was profound. It was not just a shift in material culture, but a shift in how people related to each other. Iron, which was once a rare commodity, became the backbone of societies. While its abundance allowed for more equitable access to tools, weapons, and resources, it also demanded specialized knowledge to work it. Ironworking became a respected and crucial craft, and those who had the skill to forge iron became key figures in their communities. This shift towards specialized trades reinforced a more diversified and inclusive social structure, as the power to control essential resources was no longer monopolized by the elites, but was spread across different strata of society. Iron also played a role in the cultural transformation that followed the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. The societies that embraced the new metal had to rethink their ways of governance, economic organization, and social interaction. With the loss of centralized authority, communities began to adopt more localized forms of governance and leadership. It was a time of innovation, not just in tools and weapons, but in how societies functioned. The collapse of the Bronze Age world created an environment ripe for experimentation, and iron provided the foundation upon which new forms of life and organization were built. As we look back at the rise of iron and its transformative impact on ancient societies, it becomes clear that it was not merely a technological shift. It was a catalyst for a broader cultural transformation. It forced ancient people to rethink their relationship to power, to resources, and to each other. It gave rise to a more localized, self-sustaining world where communities were not reliant on fragile external systems, but were empowered to forge their own paths. Iron was a symbol of resilience, adaptability, and human ingenuity in the face of collapse, and its influence would shape the course of history for millennia. Today, the story of the Iron Age resonates with us as we face our own challenges. We live in a world that, much like the ancient world, is undergoing profound change. Whether it is technological disruption, political instability, or environmental crisis, the challenges we face today are significant. But just as the rise of iron marked the beginning of a new world after the collapse of the Bronze Age, so too can we see our current moment as a time for transformation. The challenges we face are not the end. They are the beginning of a new era, one where we have the potential to innovate, adapt, and forge a new path forward. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, while devastating in its time, laid the groundwork for the world we live in today. It was the emergence of iron that brought about the rise of new civilizations, new technologies, and new ways of thinking. And just as iron changed the ancient world, so too can we learn from its lessons today. In times of crisis, it is often the hardest moments that lead to the greatest breakthroughs. Iron, once a material of scarcity and rarity, became the foundation of a new world. And in the same way, the challenges we face today can become the foundation for a new future, one that is built on resilience, adaptability, and the ability to transform adversity into opportunity. Just as iron shaped the ancient world, so too can we shape our future. The rise of iron and the subsequent transformation of ancient societies are pivotal moments in human history. However, as much as we focus on the emergence of iron as the foundation for a new age, we must also turn our attention to the social and cultural shifts that accompanied it. The very fabric of society was being rewritten as the old world, dominated by Bronze Age economies, crumbled. In this era of profound transition, the very systems that had sustained civilization, trade, politics, culture, were tested and found wanting. The collapse of these systems set the stage for new forms of societal organization, and iron became both the metaphor and the tool for this fundamental change. The Bronze Age had been an age of centralized power and interconnected networks. Great empires, trade routes, and social hierarchies flourished under the auspices of bronze, which was a precious commodity. It was the foundation of military power, economic systems, and cultural achievements. Yet, when the collapse came, it wasn't just the loss of cities and kingdoms that caused the most lasting impact. It was the collapse of this interconnected web of trade and authority. Entire networks of commerce were severed, and the elites who controlled the flow of precious resources were displaced. This sudden fragmentation of the old order was destabilizing, but it also created the possibility for something new to emerge, something more resilient, more decentralized, and ultimately more sustainable. In the wake of the collapse, societies that had once relied on trade and centralized systems of authority had to adapt to a new reality. They had no choice but to reinvent their political, economic, and social systems. Iron, which had once been a rare and exotic commodity, now became the backbone of this reinvention. It wasn't just the practical applications of iron in tools, weapons, and agriculture that transformed these societies, but the very act of adopting iron forced these societies to rethink their entire way of life. Iron allowed for the democratization of resources and the decentralization of power. The material was abundant and could be worked by anyone who had the necessary knowledge and skill. The old model, where access to valuable materials was restricted to the elites, was replaced by a world where people could access the resources they needed to survive and thrive. This decentralization of power wasn't just about material wealth, it was about social structures. In a world where trade routes no longer linked great civilizations, and where powerful central authorities could no longer control the distribution of resources, local communities began to take control of their own destinies. This shift in power dynamics was revolutionary. People no longer had to rely on the trade of luxury goods or precious metals from distant lands. They could produce what they needed locally, using iron. This change in the availability of resources gave rise to a new kind of society, one that was less dependent on the whims of the powerful and more focused on local self-sufficiency. The cultural impact of this shift cannot be understated. The Bronze Age had been marked by a hierarchical structure where the elites controlled the flow of wealth and the masses were left to toil under their rule. But in the new world that emerged after the collapse, iron leveled the playing field. It allowed the common people, farmers, blacksmiths, and artisans to become the backbone of society. Power, once concentrated in the hands of a few, was now more evenly distributed among local communities. This shift was profound. It marked the beginning of a new form of social organization, one that was less focused on centralized power and more focused on the importance of local knowledge, craftsmanship, and innovation. This decentralization of power also meant that people were now more connected to the land and the resources around them. The reliance on distant trade networks, which had been so central to the Bronze Age civilizations, was no longer a viable option. Societies had to become self-sufficient, which meant that local economies began to thrive. Local blacksmiths, farmers, and artisans were no longer just cogs in a larger machine, they were the driving forces behind their own communities. This shift in power dynamics allowed for more diverse economies to flourish, where the needs of the community were met by the community itself. And with iron as the primary material, these economies were built on a more sustainable foundation than the fragile, far-reaching trade networks of the past. The rise of iron also had profound implications for warfare. In the Bronze Age, military power had been controlled by the elites, who had access to the best weapons and the most resources. The rise of iron changed this dynamic. Iron weapons, which could be mass-produced, gave smaller communities the ability to defend themselves against larger, more powerful armies. No longer were the great empires of the Bronze Age the only players on the world stage. Iron democratized warfare. The mass production of iron swords, shields, and spears allowed for a more equal distribution of military power, which meant that smaller groups, once relegated to the fringes of history, could now challenge the mighty empires that had once ruled over them. This shift in military power marked the beginning of a new age of warfare, one where smaller tribes and localized communities had the ability to protect themselves, if not dominate, their enemies. The shift to iron also brought about changes in agriculture. The introduction of iron plows, axes, and sickles revolutionized farming. With the ability to cultivate more land, people were able to settle in areas that had previously been uninhabitable. The increase in food production led to the growth of larger populations, which in turn led to the establishment of new settlements. The increased productivity in agriculture meant that fewer people were required to work the land, allowing more people to engage in other forms of labor, such as blacksmithing, pottery, and trade. The rise of iron had a direct impact on the growth of cities, which were no longer confined to areas where long-distance trade could sustain them. Instead, they could thrive in places that had previously been overlooked or ignored. The economic implications of the rise of iron were far-reaching. With the collapse of the old trade networks, societies had to create new economic models. Iron allowed for local economies to flourish, and the demand for iron tools and weapons sparked the growth of new industries. Local blacksmiths became central figures in these new economies, providing the tools necessary for survival and growth. The rise of iron also led to the development of new trade networks, ones that were smaller and more self-sufficient. The economies of the past, built on fragile trade routes and long-distance exchanges, were replaced by economies that were more localized, decentralized, and resilient. Iron was the material that allowed societies to rebuild their economies and create more sustainable systems of living. Despite the many opportunities iron brought, the transition was not without its challenges. Societies that had once thrived on trade and external resources were now forced to look inward. The collapse of the Bronze Age had left them vulnerable, and the shift to iron required new ways of thinking. The world was no longer the same. It was smaller, more isolated, and more dependent on local resources. But in this time of upheaval, there was also immense potential for growth and transformation. Iron, more than just a metal, became a symbol of human resilience. It represented the ability to adapt, to survive, and to thrive in the face of crisis. The collapse of the Bronze Age could have led to the end of civilization, but instead, it sparked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be defined by the strength, versatility, and accessibility of iron. Iron became the foundation for a new world, a world that was less reliant on the fragile systems of trade and more focused on local production and self-sufficiency. This new world was defined by resilience, adaptability, and the ability to thrive in the face of adversity. The collapse of the Bronze Age had marked the end of an era, but it had also opened the door to a new beginning, one that would be shaped by iron. Iron not only reshaped societies, but it also reshaped the way people viewed the world. It became a symbol of innovation, of survival, and of the human capacity to reinvent itself in the face of crisis. As we look back on the rise of iron and its impact on ancient societies, we are reminded of the power of transformation. Just as the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations gave birth to the Iron Age, so too can we use our own challenges to forge a new path forward. The rise of iron was a story of resilience, of overcoming adversity, and of finding new ways to thrive. And just as the ancient world was reshaped by iron, so too can we use the tools at our disposal to shape the future we want to create. The societal transformation brought about by the rise of iron was not just a technological shift, but a profound cultural reorientation that marked the dawn of a new era. In many ways, the collapse of the Bronze Age created a vacuum, a space that was not just physical but also psychological, as the old certainties and structures that had defined the known world crumbled away. Yet, it was in this very vacuum that the seeds of a new civilization were planted. The collapse, often seen as an end, was paradoxically the beginning of something transformative. Iron represented more than just a material advantage. It embodied the human drive to adapt, to overcome, and to rebuild. Where bronze had been the material of kings and empires, iron became the resource of the common people. The widespread availability of iron made it a democratizing force. No longer were societies solely dependent on distant trade routes and the elite few who controlled access to resources. Now, entire communities could access and utilize this new material, creating a more egalitarian distribution of power and wealth. In a world that had been shaped by the monopolies of the powerful, iron allowed for a new kind of societal structure, one where the individual's ability to shape and manipulate their environment mattered more than their place in a rigid hierarchical system. As people began to forge iron tools, weapons, and other implements, they realized that their dependence on the fragile trade networks of the Bronze Age was no longer necessary. Local communities could now craft the very tools they needed to survive and thrive. The ability to create iron weapons, for example, revolutionized warfare. It was no longer a matter of the elite few possessing the means to conquer and control. Even the smallest tribe could now arm itself, defend its land, and challenge the established powers of the old world. This shift in military power marked the birth of new political structures, smaller, more self-sufficient entities that no longer relied on the great empires to provide for them. This political decentralization had far-reaching implications. The political structures that had flourished during the Bronze Age were often centered around a single ruler or a centralized power, but with the rise of iron, the centers of power became more diffuse. Power was no longer vested in a few elite rulers. It was spread among many local leaders, craftsmen, and warriors, who worked together to support their communities. The rise of iron empowered the people, allowing them to form their own societies based on the resources they could access locally. These decentralized societies were more resilient, more adaptable, and better able to weather the storms of crisis. In addition to political changes, the rise of iron also brought profound social and cultural shifts. As local communities became more self-sufficient, they also began to rely more on their internal resources for cultural production. This was a time when local artisans, blacksmiths, farmers, and warriors began to take on new roles as both economic and cultural drivers of society. No longer were these people relegated to the fringes of society. They became central to the functioning of their communities. With iron as the cornerstone of their economy, they could create a culture of innovation, one where new technologies, new ideas, and new forms of artistic expression could flourish. Iron, unlike the rare and costly bronze, had the capacity to transform not just the material world, but the way people thought about their own lives and their role in society. Where bronze had been the symbol of elite power, iron was the symbol of self-reliance and resilience. Ironworking became an art that was shared by many, not just the few. It was no longer a craft reserved for kings and warriors, but was spread across society. Local blacksmiths became central figures in their communities, wielding the power to create tools and weapons that could shape the very future of their societies. The rise of iron also had an impact on agriculture. With iron ploughs and sickles, farmers could cultivate land more effectively, leading to greater food production. The introduction of these tools allowed for the expansion of farming into previously unproductive or barren lands, making it possible to support larger populations. As agricultural output increased, so did the population. The ability to feed more people allowed new settlements to flourish, creating the foundation for more complex, more resilient communities. In this way, iron didn't just change the way people fought, it changed the way they lived, allowing them to settle, grow, and expand their societies in ways that had previously been impossible. This shift in agriculture had ripple effects that were felt across society. The increased food production meant that fewer people were needed to work the land, freeing them up to engage in other forms of labor and cultural production. As people moved away from the fields and into workshops and cities, a new urban landscape began to emerge. The rise of iron coincided with the birth of new cities that were less reliant on external trade routes and more self-sufficient. These new cities were built on the foundation of local resources, and they represented a shift away from the old world of centralized power and long-distance trade. Iron was also the foundation for the growth of new trade networks. While the Bronze Age world had been built on long-distance trade routes that connected far-flung civilizations, the rise of iron allowed for more localized, resilient trade systems. Iron, as a widely available and versatile material, became the backbone of these new networks. Local communities could trade iron tools, weapons, and other products, creating a new form of commerce that was less dependent on the fragile trade routes of the past. These new networks were more sustainable, and they allowed for a more diversified economy to emerge. Yet, despite the abundance and versatility of iron, the transition was not without its difficulties. Societies that had once relied on long-distance trade were forced to adapt to a new way of living. The collapse of the Bronze Age had left them vulnerable, and the rise of iron required new ways of thinking and new technologies. Societies had to find ways to build new economies, new political systems, and new cultural norms. But in the face of these challenges, iron provided the foundation for a new world. Iron became a symbol of the resilience and ingenuity of human beings. It allowed societies to rebuild, to innovate, and to adapt in the face of adversity. The rise of iron marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history. It was a chapter defined by the transformation of society, economy, and culture. Iron was not just a material, it was a symbol of human resilience, of the ability to adapt, survive, and thrive in the face of crisis. Just as the Bronze Age civilizations gave birth to the Iron Age, we too can use the challenges of our own time to forge a new path forward. In every crisis, there is the potential for transformation. Just as iron reshaped the ancient world, so too can we use our tools to shape the future we want to create. The fall of the Bronze Age was not just the collapse of a material culture, but the unraveling of a complex, interconnected world built on centuries of trade, political power, and shared knowledge. Yet, even in the ruins of once thriving civilizations, humanity found a way to rise. The new world that emerged in the wake of destruction was one shaped not only by the availability of iron, but by the profound lessons of adaptability, resilience, and reinvention. As people began to work with iron, they did not just rebuild what was lost. They set the stage for a new era, one that would redefine the course of history. Iron, which had once been rare and often seen as an inferior metal compared to bronze, emerged as the key to survival. It was in abundance, found in the Earth's crust in places as diverse as Scandinavia's bogs and the rich deposits of Central Europe. Unlike bronze, which required the complex importation of tin from far-flung lands, iron could be sourced locally, making it accessible to a broader segment of society. Its mass availability was not merely a technical advantage, it was a profound societal shift that allowed new communities to thrive. In an era where old trade networks had collapsed, iron provided the material foundation for local economies, allowing them to become self-sufficient. This was a transformative moment, one that shifted the locus of power from centralized elites and distant rulers to local communities that could now wield the power to create, to defend, and to flourish. For many, iron was not just a replacement for bronze, it represented a new way of thinking and living. The very process of working with iron required a different set of skills, a new understanding of metallurgy, and an entirely new approach to the world. Unlike bronze, which could be easily shaped and molded, iron required more intense heat, skill, and patience. The furnaces that were built to smelt iron were more complex, the forging techniques more demanding. The first iron tools, crude and inefficient compared to their bronze counterparts, were less effective, but iron held immense promise, and through centuries of experimentation, societies learned to harness its potential. It became stronger, more versatile, and more abundant than anything that had come before. What began as a humble material soon became the backbone of a new world, one that would rise from the ashes of the old. The democratization of iron had profound implications. No longer would power be in the hands of a few who controlled the trade routes or the precious metals. Iron put the means of production in the hands of ordinary people. Local blacksmiths, once marginalized, became central figures in their communities. Farmers, warriors, and artisans, who once depended on trade for tools and resources, were now empowered to produce what they needed on their own. Iron was the great equalizer. It allowed societies to be less dependent on foreign sources of wealth, less vulnerable to the instability of distant empires, and more self-reliant. Iron, in essence, marked the beginning of the decentralization of power, a shift from a world governed by the elites to one that placed a greater emphasis on local knowledge, local production, and local resilience. This shift had not just economic consequences but social ones as well. The collapse of centralized power structures left a vacuum, one that communities had to fill themselves. Iron, by enabling local economies to thrive, also reshaped the social fabric of these emerging societies. The skills required to work iron created new hierarchies within communities, but these hierarchies were not the rigid, elite-driven structures of the Bronze Age. Instead, they were more flexible, based on local knowledge and craftsmanship. A blacksmith in a small village had as much influence as a warrior, a farmer, or a merchant. People were no longer dependent on far-off rulers to provide for them. Instead, they turned inward, relying on their own resources and ingenuity to create sustainable, self-sufficient societies. In warfare, this transformation was particularly striking. In the Bronze Age, military power was concentrated in the hands of the ruling elites, whose control over the best weapons and most advanced technologies allowed them to dominate other cultures. But with the rise of iron, military power was no longer the monopoly of the few. Iron weapons, swords, spears, and shields could be mass-produced. Smaller, less powerful communities were able to defend themselves against larger empires, leveling the playing field and making warfare more accessible to everyone. Iron weapons, produced in large quantities, were cheaper and more durable than bronze ones, meaning that even the most isolated tribes could now equip themselves for battle. Iron, in this sense, transformed not just warfare but the very balance of power. The democratization of warfare was mirrored in agriculture. The introduction of iron plows and sickles revolutionized farming. Iron tools made it possible to till more land and harvest crops more efficiently. The increased productivity in agriculture led to population growth, and as food production soared, communities could support larger settlements. Iron gave rise to a new pattern of settlement, one where people were not confined to areas dependent on long-distance trade. Instead, they could now establish new communities based on the local production of food, goods, and resources. In essence, iron allowed human beings to settle more widely, develop new villages, and even establish new cities in places that had once been inhospitable. The rise of iron also fostered a sense of autonomy in these new communities. As local economies began to flourish, people were no longer dependent on external systems or distant trade networks. They were self-reliant. They could produce their own tools, weapons, and food. The old Bronze Age economies had been dependent on a complex network of trade routes that connected distant regions. These systems were fragile, vulnerable to attack, collapse, and disruption. In contrast, the rise of iron led to the development of more robust and independent local economies, where communities could create and sustain themselves without the need for vast, centralized systems of control. This local self-sufficiency did not mean isolation. On the contrary, as local economies grew, so did the need for localized trade networks. Small villages, towns, and cities began to trade with one another, exchanging the products of their labor for the goods they couldn't produce themselves. Iron, as a resource, played a crucial role in the creation of these new, decentralized networks of commerce. While the vast trade routes of the Bronze Age collapsed, new, smaller trade networks emerged, allowing local economies to thrive and flourish. Iron also changed the social fabric of ancient societies in more subtle ways. The accessibility of iron allowed for more flexible, dynamic social organizations. Communities that once had rigid hierarchies could now develop systems of cooperation and mutual aid. Farmers and blacksmiths worked together to cultivate the land and forge tools, creating a more integrated society. Local artisans, skilled in working iron, became central figures in their communities. It was a society in which the role of each individual, whether they worked the land, created goods, or defended the community, was equally valued. The rise of iron was, in many ways, a catalyst for cultural innovation. As people moved away from the centralized systems that had once governed their lives, they began to develop new forms of governance, new social norms, and new ways of thinking about the world. Iron allowed people to look inward and create something that was uniquely their own. The collapse of the old systems didn't just leave a void, it created a space for innovation and creativity. Iron became not just a material resource, but a symbol of the human capacity to adapt, survive, and thrive. The Age of Iron was one of transformation, of reinvention. It was a time when people learned to rebuild their lives from the ground up. The collapse of the Bronze Age, while devastating, gave birth to a new era of resilience, autonomy, and empowerment. It was the beginning of a world where communities were no longer bound by the fragility of distant trade routes or the dominance of a few elites. Iron, in its versatility and abundance, allowed humanity to create a new kind of world, one that was based on local production, local knowledge, and local power. As we look back on the rise of iron, we are reminded of our own ability to adapt and innovate in the face of crisis. Just as the people of the ancient world used iron to shape a new future, we too can use the challenges of our own time to create something stronger, more resilient, and more enduring. Iron, both as a material and a symbol, teaches us that even in the most difficult of times, transformation is possible. The rise of iron was not just the story of a new metal, it was the story of human perseverance and the power to rebuild, reshape, and reinvent the world we live in. The emergence of iron marked the dawn of a new era, but it was not a smooth transition. The collapse of the Bronze Age had left societies fragmented and vulnerable, and yet iron provided an opportunity for rebirth and transformation. It was more than just a material revolution. It was the key to unlocking human potential in an age of uncertainty and change. As the ancient world grappled with the aftermath of the collapse, iron emerged not only as the foundation for new technologies, but also as a symbol of resilience, creativity, and self-sufficiency. It was an anchor in an otherwise turbulent time. While the introduction of iron enabled societies to rebuild in countless ways, it also posed significant challenges. The material itself was abundant, but working with it required new knowledge, new tools, and new ways of thinking. Iron had to be smelted at higher temperatures than bronze, and its forging demanded more skill and precision. This was not a process that could be quickly or easily mastered. In the early days of ironworking, the metal was crude, and its products were less efficient than those made from bronze. However, necessity drove innovation, and over time, societies honed their skills and perfected the techniques of ironworking. This process of trial and error, innovation and adaptation, allowed them to develop iron tools and weapons that were stronger, more durable, and more versatile than anything they had previously known. As iron became more widely available, it transformed not only the physical landscape, but the social and political landscape as well. The power structures that had once been dominated by the elites, who controlled precious materials and trade routes, began to shift. Iron was abundant and could be accessed by anyone who possessed the necessary skills, meaning that power was no longer concentrated in the hands of a few. Communities no longer had to rely on trade networks and distant rulers for their survival. With iron, they could meet their needs locally and begin to develop their own self-sustaining economies. This decentralization of power had profound implications for the structure of society. The societal shift that iron brought about was not limited to economics. As communities adapted to their new material reality, they also had to adapt their social structures. The rise of iron meant that the previously rigid hierarchies of the Bronze Age were no longer the only model. People began to rely more on cooperation and shared knowledge. The blacksmith, once a marginalized figure, became a central part of the community. Farmers, artisans, and warriors all could contribute to the local economy, working in concert with one another to ensure the survival and prosperity of their villages. This was a world in which local knowledge and craftsmanship held more value than ever before. In many ways, the rise of iron marked the birth of a new form of community. These were communities that were not dependent on the trade routes of the past, which had been fragile and easily disrupted. Instead, iron allowed for a more resilient, self-sufficient way of life. Societies began to thrive independently of external systems, making it possible for new, smaller communities to flourish. These communities did not need to rely on distant empires or centralized governments to survive. They were defined by their ability to adapt, innovate, and create local economies built around the abundance of iron. This transformation was especially evident in warfare. Prior to the rise of iron, military power had been largely controlled by elites, who had access to the best weapons and the most advanced technologies. The introduction of iron democratized military power, giving smaller, less powerful communities the ability to defend themselves against larger, more established empires. Iron weapons, such as swords, shields, and spears, could be mass-produced, making them more affordable and accessible to all. No longer was military power concentrated in the hands of a few. The rise of iron meant that smaller groups, who had previously been powerless, could now challenge the larger empires and kingdoms that once ruled over them. This new power dynamic was also mirrored in agriculture. Iron tools such as plows, sickles, and axes revolutionized farming, making it possible to cultivate more land, harvest crops more efficiently, and produce food on a much larger scale. As food production grew, so did the population, leading to the establishment of new settlements and communities. The rise of iron meant that people could establish themselves in areas that had once been too difficult or inhospitable to inhabit. This ability to cultivate and sustain larger populations created new opportunities for people to settle and build communities without relying on the long-distance trade that had once been the backbone of the ancient world. The economic impact of iron was profound. With the collapse of the old trade networks, societies had to become more self-reliant. Iron was the key to this transformation, as it allowed for the creation of local industries and the development of self-sustaining economies. Local blacksmiths, metalworkers, and farmers became the driving force behind these new economies, providing the tools and materials needed for survival. Iron also led to the development of smaller, more localized trade networks, which allowed communities to exchange goods and services without depending on fragile and often dangerous long-distance trade routes. As societies began to rely more on local economies, they also began to develop more localized forms of governance. The shift from centralized systems of power to decentralized ones allowed for more flexibility and innovation. Ironworking, while not an easy skill to master, was widely accessible and became central to the functioning of these new societies. The democratization of iron and the decentralization of power marked the beginning of a new form of governance, one that emphasized the importance of local knowledge, craftsmanship, and self-sufficiency. The rise of iron was not just a revolution in material culture, it was a revolution in human potential. It represented the ability of human societies to adapt and innovate in the face of crisis. The collapse of the Bronze Age, while devastating, sparked a transformation that reshaped the world. Iron became the symbol of human resilience, the material that allowed societies to rebuild and reinvent themselves in ways that were not possible before. The rise of iron, in many ways, laid the foundation for the modern world. It was a time of immense change, but it was also a time of immense opportunity, a time when humanity proved its ability to rise from the ashes of destruction and build something new, something more resilient, something that would endure. As we look at the challenges facing us today, whether they are political, environmental, or social, we can draw inspiration from the rise of iron. Just as the ancient world used iron to rebuild and reinvent itself, we too can use the tools at our disposal to create a better future. The rise of iron teaches us that even in the most challenging times, transformation is possible. What seems like a collapse, a moment of crisis, may, in fact, be the beginning of something new and extraordinary. The rise of iron was the beginning of a new era, one that reshaped the world, and now, as we face our own challenges, we must embrace the spirit of reinvention and use the tools we have at hand to forge a new future.